We are the Mission Possible Partnership, an alliance of climate leaders on the road to transforming 7 of the highest emitting industries towards net zero emission. Through radical collaboration with industry leaders, their customers, financial institutions, and governments, we are creating a flywheel, decarbonizing industries. By providing sector strategies and a compass and developing the tools to implement them, we're setting the milestones for the next decade and igniting climate action. Are you a climate leader? Together, let's unlock investment and make net zero industry and mobility pillars of the new global economy.
A very warm welcome, everyone, to this high-level panel session hosted by Reuters Events and the Mission Possible Partnership. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large for Reuters, based out of London. And it is my job today to moderate the panel on behalf of Reuters editorial. Making the impossible possible, the blueprint for decarbonizing industry is our title. And today we focus on decarbonization in 4 of the 7 hard-to-abate industries. These industries together responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Now, multi-trillion-dollar plans are in the works to transition these sectors to net zero by 2050, but what we really need is a close look at the how, the metrics, the milestones, a better understanding of the pathways that will really drive action and momentum in this critical decade ahead. MPP has, of course, as its mission the supercharging, if you like, of industrial decarbonization, and today the partnership unveils the landmark sector transition strategies, as well as the multi-trillion-dollar cost of decarbonizing the shipping, the aviation, and the steel industries. Things are happening. We are seeing competitors working together for the first time, beyond their bottom lines, beyond their sectors, to act and create tipping points that might well drive systemic change ahead. But they need traction, they need scaling up, and change needs to happen boldly enough and quickly enough to make a difference here. Of course, there are other pieces critical to making this work: the right policy frameworks to ensure solutions scale up at pace, and the appropriate engagement and support of the financial sector. We'll talk about all of this with our panel in just a moment. MPP's message is clear enough, though, that industry is ready and is willing for the clean transformation that will open up new business opportunities. It's ready and willing to commit to tangible actions catalyzing climate change. It's a bold message, it's an audacious message, but it's an exciting one, and one that I'm keen to stress test with our panel. Let me introduce the speakers today. Scott Kirby is the CEO of United Airlines. Aditya Mittal is the CEO of ArcelorMittal. Anne Finucane is Vice Chair, Bank of America. Konrad Kaicher is CEO of Clariant. Rasmus Bach-Nielsen is the global head of fuel decarbonization at Trafigura, and Anthony Hobley and Faustine de la Salle are co-executive directors at the Mission Possible Partnership. So a very warm welcome to all of you. We're going to run about 45 minutes, then I'll open things up to you, our audience. You can follow the discussion as well on Twitter at MPP Industry, and LinkedIn under the hashtag Mission Possible Partnership. Of course, you can follow on all the Reuters platforms as well. I'd like to kick it off, if I may, with a question to MPP, who of course brought us here today, and to you, Faustine. There seems to be an equal measure of optimism as well as skepticism and indeed fear out there about exactly what can be achieved and by when. But we've got a group of leaders with us today who are, I think, prepared to put their money where their mouth is, for want of a better phrase. How important is the conversation today? And what do you think, what do you hope we can get done?
It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thanks a lot for the panelists with us today. Look, I want to come back to the MPP journey to answer your question. The MPP journey started in November 2018, and that's when the Energy Transitions Commission published a first report called Mission Possible, that then became the Mission Possible Partnership, which was the first global report to say that it was technically and economically feasible to reach net zero emissions in the hard to abate sectors of the economy, in heavy industry, in heavy duty mobility by mid-century. And at the time when we published that report, we were seen by many as radical environmentalists and by a few as crazy hippies. And if you fast forward 3 years, MPP is now mobilizing more than 300 companies across 7 sectors, 4 in the industry space and 3 in the mobility space, to transform the vision we had laid out in 2018 into reality. And we're doing so with a number of the biggest industry players in this space, which now makes us less of crazy hippies and much more in the space of making things happen at the right scale. The challenge we have in front of us is really big. You mentioned that it's 30% of CO2 emissions today that we need to tackle, and the solutions to get there are often in the pipeline, but not yet commercially competitive. And we need to make very huge progress in the 2020s to be on the right trajectory. So it's quite a daunting task that we have in front of us. And it will take everything you've mentioned earlier. It will take technologies, it will take new business models, it will take a multi-trillion investment plan. But it also takes something that is much more subtle that the players that we have on the panel today have demonstrated, which is radical collaboration. Because we need multiple forms of radical collaboration to make this happen within the value chains themselves, between the energy intensive players, their energy suppliers, their technology providers, their buyers, the buyers of their buyers. We also need collaboration across value chains, in particular to get the energy infrastructure off the ground. We need collaboration between corporates and governments to design the right policies. We need collaboration between countries to establish a level playing field for those sectors that are facing international competition. And we need collaboration between civil society organizations who support that movement, which is the reason why MPP was set up purposefully as a collaboration between 4 founding partners and a much broader set of collaborators and organizations joining forces to support the industry on that journey. So radical collaboration is really at the core of it. And it could sound very fluffy and not very concrete, but it has yielded very concrete results. We are launching today a first wave of 3 sector transition strategies, which basically provide the map of how do we go from today's high emissions to zero emissions by mid-century, and all of the critical milestones that need to be hit along the way in steel and aviation and shipping, and we'll produce a new wave of those sector transition strategies next year in other sectors. And that's really the foundational piece that we need to then inform the action from the players that we have around the table. And those players are really responding present. We've seen today the chemicals industry launching a pre-competitive zero carbon technology development platform. Last month, we've seen 60 companies in the aviation space committing to 10% sustainable aviation fuels by 2030. We've also seen 150 companies in the shipping space under the Getting to Zero coalition committing to taking very tangible investments pre-2030 on zero carbon shipping. So, and we see the buyers of those key sectors also mobilizing themselves in Buyers Club, and we see financial institutions raising to the challenge, preparing plans for first-of-a-kind investments and for portfolio alignment. So that momentum in the private sector makes me very optimistic. It's far from being at the level at which we need. We're still far away from the right trajectory, but it creates the right foundations for us to move forward. And it also constitutes a cry for help, I'd say, vis-a-vis policymakers pre-COP. Because that journey, even if it started by forward-looking leaders like the ones we have around the table today, will not be fast enough if we don't have support from policymakers. And COP is the right moment to ensure that companies who are active in this space send that message to policymakers around the world. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion today, but wanted to thank warmly all of the industry leaders who have been with us on that journey, and invite the others who haven't been with us to join us in the next stretch as well.
Okay, very good. Faustine, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's hear from the leaders we have with us today. And Scott, I want to start with you. It's a general question on action, and then we'll get to the how in just a moment. Intensity reduction targets are one thing, but the real deal here is absolute emissions reduction along with healthy business growth. So a true decoupling, if you like. How far are you from that crossover point now in aviation?
Well, in aviation, a lot of these hard to decarbonize industries, and look, I think this is the important point today, is to acknowledge that there are hard to decarbonize industries, but that there are real steps we can take, but we have to be real about it. And in particular, we've got to avoid letting companies, airlines, steel, you talked about steel, shipping, get away with greenwashing, because if we don't do that, then we'll never get this solved. And in aviation, the answers, unfortunately, aren't all in the short term doable, but we've got to start making the investments today. So sustainable aviation fuel is a big part of it for aviation. And today, United represents, our commitment to sustainable aviation fuel is more than double all the rest of the world's airlines combined. I hope that's a statistic, by the way, that I can't use very much longer, because everyone else catches up to us and we're chasing after them as well, because this shouldn't be a competitive issue. We need to solve it together. I think an important part of using sustainable aviation fuel, however, and there's some in the industry that disagree with me, is we should commit to sustainable aviation fuel that is not sourced from farm products. Because if we're using farmland to create fuel, there's all kinds of other negative environmental impacts, is point one. Second, we should invest in technology, things like electric aircraft, but that's never going to replace, at least in the foreseeable future, big long-haul aircraft flying long distances. And third, and I think most importantly for all the hard to decarbonize industries, is sequestration. And this is my point that I started with about greenwashing. We've got to get away from carbon offsets, the traditional carbon offsets, because most of them aren't real. And if if 1% of them are real, we let the 100% count, we're never going to solve this problem unless we get away from that.
Okay, Scott, just to very quickly follow up on that, you mentioned sustainable aviation fuel, you mentioned innovation. If we bring both of those into this equation, when could we start to see the curve bending down in aviation? Could it be before 2030, or is that too optimistic?
I think we'll make huge progress in terms of the percentage of fuel, the amount of fuel that we're using from sustainable aviation fuel between now and 2030. But it starts at such a small level. Even if we increase it by 10x, it's still going to be small. 10 times a small number is still a small number. But what I hope we do this decade is significantly increase it, but more importantly, that we commercialize sustainable aviation fuel and that we use other feedstock that aren't out of the farm chain. And we've begun to commercialize and make those economically viable. It is why, by the way, it's important to get government support here in the United States, sustainable aviation fuel credit around the world, really to do what happened for wind and solar. 20 years ago, wind and solar were uneconomic and could not compete with coal or natural gas. Today, it's cheaper almost everywhere in the world to produce power from wind and solar because there were government credits that drove down that cost curve.
All right, Scott, thanks a lot. We'll come back to a number of these points. I just want to get a sense from all of our guests first. Aditya, let me come to you. Same sort of question. Can you do this, bring this curve down and remain a profitable business with happy shareholders? Is that possible for you in the steel sector?
All of it, probably not. But I think with some changes to the regulatory environment and the customer environment, sure. So let me just take a step back. I think Scott did a great job describing the challenges he sees in aviation. As you mentioned, steel is responsible for 7% of global emissions. So clearly a sector which has to decarbonize. The good news about steel is that it is a sustainable material. So if you look at any other material in the world, it already has the lowest carbon footprint and is infinitely recyclable. The really good news is that we can decarbonize steel. So it's not a question of is the technology available or how do you do it? There are some questions that need to be answered, but fundamentally, I think we see the pathway to decarbonize. The issue is, and I think it's perhaps not too different from sustainable aviation fuel, is the cost of that energy. right? So there are two aspects that we need from the energy supply. One obviously is renewable energy, which as Scott mentioned is already low cost. It's not 24/7. And we run our steel facilities 24 hours, 7 days a week, just the inherent nature of how steel is made. And so we need storage capability. Secondly, to really purify and make high quality steel, we need a gas-based fuel, and that's really hydrogen. And we know that, yes, the world can make hydrogen, but the cost of hydrogen is exorbitant. So I think what are the key enablers? I think there are a few. Number one, clearly government support to fund all of these industries, whether it is more renewable energy, battery storage, as well as affordable and clean hydrogen, I think is absolutely critical. But the other thing is also a level playing field, right? Today, China is half of the global steel industry. So if we do not address what's going on in China and other parts of the world, we will end up not having a steel industry in the developed world and end up importing pollution. So you need some sort of a carbon border adjustment or a global carbon price or some sort of level playing field so that there's an incentive to decarbonize and remain competitive. The good news is on the market side or the customer side, I think there is a massive amount of appetite. So we have launched our green steel this year. We have very little quantity. It's sold out. A lot of customer interest, more than we imagined. Everyone is keen. We can see now that our customers are actually accelerating their plans to roll this out. So I think the real issue is cost of energy, and then how do we create a level playing field?
Yeah. Good. All right, Aditya. And again, we're going to come back to a number of these things. Conrad, same sort of top line thought from you. Announcement today that 10 major chemical companies are partnering across the value chain to move this process forward. How hopeful are you in light of what's happening in your sector now?
Sure. Well, if you look at what's happening in chemicals, maybe first to put it in perspective, Axel, as an industry, we are responsible for 2.9 gigatons, which does represent roughly 5 to 6% of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. More specifically, what needs to be done and what the chemical industry is working on, if you break this down, roughly 60% of our emissions, our carbon footprint, is actually associated with the energy that we procure, the energy to basically fuel our processes. Then another 40% is actually associated with the emissions from our processes. So what really needs to be done and what we're actually working on is, first of all, in terms of the 60% energy consumption, we need to electrify our plants. So what you see is so basically what you see is furnaces, boilers, steam crackers basically are fired with gas, sometimes even with coal. So these need to be electrified. What is then the second step is the electricity that we consume in our operations needs to be green, ideally solar, wind, hydro. So that as far as the energy consumption. Then the 40% that's associated with process emissions, very much what is needed is to get our processes more efficient. Catalysts play a key role in this. This is what Clariant offers. Catalysts that basically allow processes to take place at lower reaction temperatures, higher yields, all these kind of things. It is a big challenge. We've all read the recent IPCC report. We're actually behind in terms of our target setting versus the Paris Climate Treaty, but the technology is there, so it can be done.
Okay, good. Rasmus, there's a lot happening across the maritime supply chain. I've seen the call to action for shipping decarbonization. There's a lot in there. I know Trafigura has put a lot of pressure on in terms of a carbon levy. How hopeful are you that we're going to get the traction needed now? Because it's been particularly slow in the shipping sector, right?
Excellent. Thanks for having me today. Well, how hopeful am I? To start there, I'm very hopeful, but we're also cognizant of all the huge challenges that still persist. Global regulation on the waters are done through the IMO, International Maritime Organizations. It's 180 different delegates carrying one vote each. A lot of them have different interests. It's very difficult to bring them together. One of the big challenges the shipping industry historically have had is it has not been able to agree on what it wanted and what it needed. Going to the call to action, and this is one of the things that helps make me hopeful. Well, the call to action is the first time as long as we probably can look back in shipping, where there is a united voice in shipping that asks for one particular thing. And call to action is signed by more than 160 shipping and non-shipping entities. And what does it mean? So the call to action is a call for governments to act. Yeah. So for the first time, have we seen a political mandate provided for governments to go and act to cost neutralize the use of zero carbon fuels? And that is a tremendous step. So that's the first element. So we've seen a huge mindset change since we launched our IMO global-led shipping decarbonization program 12 months ago. But of course, there's a huge amount of work still to be done, leading towards COP and leading towards the next IMO MEPC meeting, which is end November this year. So starting out there, I'm hopeful, but also we see the challenges still around us.
Okay, good. Thank you for those thoughts, Rasmus. And there's a lot of momentum in the finance space, a lot of ambitious pledges here. I guess the question here is how to ensure these translate into concrete action. You know, how do we make sure that the bankability of breakthrough technology is at the level it should be at? What are the biggest headaches for you, do you think, going forward?
Well, I think
no. This is for Anne. Sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Thank you. Well, there are a couple of things. One is just to go back to what's been said here. These innovations in green steel or sustainable aviation fuel really follow on to what we did earlier on in wind and solar and electric cars. And of course, they had tax credits that were associated with them, and therefore you could expand them. And that's what we need here. We need some sort of scheme that is recognized both in the US and Europe to begin with, UK as well, that there's some incentive to do more of this. I mean, traditionally, these early innovations are banked, if you will, by venture capital and private equity. But the reality is we really actually need traditional banking to get in here behind that and create debt facilities. That's more difficult because there's a more punitive sort of set of requirements that prevent us from doing as much. I will say this. I think the tax incentives and credits from wind, solar, electric cars is a bellwether for what can be done. We've seen some funds that have been created that really are creating momentum. Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy has recently announced a breakthrough catalyst fund. We are the only large bank, BlackRock is in there too as a financial institution, where we're putting in essentially venture money into something that will have lower returns but greater sustainability. And if I'd like to just add one thing, which is contradictory to what Scott just said on offsets. I think offsets are a huge opportunity, just simply not the way they are today. They are too small, they're hard to verify, they're completely delinked. So I'm with you there. But if you could, in the future, find a way to create a sort of synthetic offset world where, as people try to get to carbon neutrality, that last mile, the thing they're trying to offset instead is capital put into funds that then help with concessionary capital and first loss, we could accelerate so much more quickly. And we're just not being, I think, innovative enough and open enough with governments to make that happen.
All right. Look, Scott, I'm going to come to you on the offset point in just a sec, but and just a follow up there for you. Given the concern over greenwashing, and it's something else that we've heard about today as well, distinguishing real green from green enough to earn a subsidy. Given the impacts of a slowdown on the green capital revolution, how do we insulate the capital flows from the ups and downs of the market?
Well, I think you have to have an agreed upon taxonomy. You have to have agreed upon disclosures. Disclosures are a way of compelling everyone to get their act together. I do think that you've seen through this Glasgow Financial Alliance to Net Zero, GFANZ as it's called, you've seen enough financial firms that represent about $88 trillion in assets. This is motivation enough to see the money is there. If we can agree on a taxonomy and disclosure so that it can't be greenwashing, it's all, if it's transparent, people get it together pretty quickly. And I think if we can have some harmonization in terms of regulation between or amongst the EU, UK, and the US as a start, that will be a way to the future.
All right, good. Thank you, Anne. Scott, just come back on Anne's point on offsets here. This idea of a synthetic offset world, as she put it.
Okay, I thought there was a question coming, but I'll just respond. So look, when I try to say it carefully as traditional offsets, which mostly means planting trees, and there are some good offsets. In fact, carbon sequestration is technically an offset. That's why I try to say traditional offsets. But most of the tree planting programs are just not real. It's people paying to not cut down a forest that's never been cut down in the history of mankind, that's at a 60-degree incline, that's never going to be cut down, and they're just not real. And the reality, and I can give you a long list of examples for the next hour of programs that are just not real, that people are claiming carbon offsets for. But the bigger point is, we produce 4,000 times as many emissions as we did in the pre-industrial era. There's not space on the planet to plant enough trees to account for that. Indy Burke at Yale gave me a stat that I'll use, and I've converted it into months. If we planted all of the space on the planet that could have trees and could magically make them mature overnight, it would account for less than 5 months of mankind's emissions. And by the way, we're not going to do that. But when every company, almost every company, is using that as their way to say they're net zero, we will not solve the problem. I think it's the most important point if we're going to be real about solving climate change. If it's a marketing message that every single company can say, I did it, it's checked off, I wrote a check to a conservancy fund, and there's some forest somewhere in the world, that I'm taking credit for, and maybe 5 other people are taking credit for, we just won't solve the problem. There are real offset programs. Carbon sequestration is one of them. But most of the programs are about planting trees, and most of them are not real.
All right. Look, I want to move it on to collaboration, and Aditya, let me start with you on this. Success, it seems to me, on these decarbonisation pathways requires unprecedented levels of collaboration up and down the value chain, which might ultimately, I guess, mean helping competitors follow in your footsteps. I wonder how much that might, and how much you worry about that diluting the potential for competitive advantage. Aditya.
Sure. I'm not sure whether you actually help your competitors or you kind of lead the way, create a marketplace, so encourage everyone else to accelerate. So to give you an example, I talked about XCarb, which is our certified green steel. And so as we get to talk to customers that, look, we can offer you this product, it's not a lot of quantity, but there's some availability, the availability will increase. We have now seen 2 or 3 other steel companies with the same thing in Europe, right? And I saw one actually in North America as well. So I think if you start leading the way, I think competitors today, I think it's a very dynamic world. People catch up very quickly. They recognize climate action, climate strategy is critical to long-term success. They want to emulate you. And that's fine, and that's good. So I think we have announced a bunch of projects to decarbonize our facilities. We have announced multi-billion-dollar capital commitments as a result of that. And I can see that that is also accelerating and competitors are doing the same. So I think that's one aspect of collaboration. You lead the way in terms of industry. The math may not work, but you feel that at least at the end of the day, if you create a sustainable business, you have decarbonized, the customer will be there and there will be some return. And then it forces everyone to catch up and suddenly that's the new norm. The other aspect of collaboration, I think, is on the technology side. I think everyone has one thing in common that they need to make this transition is low cost and appropriate forms of energy. And so there's a lot of collaboration and looking at companies which could provide this. I think Anne mentioned Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, right? So one of their ideas is to do sustainable aviation fuel and bring other partners, and we're also interested because I'm sure there'll be benefits to our business as well. The same thing goes for solar technology. Can we refine it to improve its capture rate, battery storage? And so I see a lot of collaboration between companies in different industries, sometimes in the same industries, investing in the same businesses so that they can accelerate their time to market.
Okay. Conrad, do you ever find yourself having to to square a similar question, but to square the problem of pursuing competitive advantage for a sustainability premium with the need for collaboration and the sharing of innovation. The question to you, Conrad, and then Scott, I'd be interested to get your opinion on this as well.
Oh, I think it's a great question, and I think it actually requires a bit of a mindset shift, because in this, the change is so massive that we have ahead of us that we actually do need to collaborate, not just downstream with our clients or upstream with suppliers, but also with competitors. Let me give you a very specific example. Our company developed unique second generation technology to produce bioethanol from waste. I think, Scott, this is for you an important point. This is not competing with the food chain. We actually waste from crop, which is normally low in sugar content. We bring in enzymes, bring the sugar content up, and then convert it to bioethanol, which can actually be used as a sustainable airline fuel. Now, this is unique technology exactly for the reason that it is not actually using the crop, but it's using waste, which typically is low in sugar content. We're actually starting up this factory tomorrow as we speak, a 50,000 ton factory in Romania. Now, as Clariant, we could build 100 factories for second generation bioethanol. And we actually decided in the end not to do that. So we decided to basically use this plant to basically as a proof point for the technology as well as commercial viability. We're going to license this technology now, in essence, to whoever likes to produce this second generation bioethanol, which allows this technology to really scale up so much faster than we ever could do it. But it does require a mindset shift, and this was not, in fact, our original plan, but this is actually very much going to be a license model, and I'm excited about it.
All right, good, Conrad, thank you. Scott, similar to you, just talk to us a little bit about your role and how you see your role as an influencer, within the sector to enable real change. What's your call to action for your peers?
So, well, first, thank you, Conrad. I'm aware of what you guys are doing on the using that feedstock. There's some others here in the United States that are doing the same thing. That's really important that we get people investing in the right feedstock. I'm increasingly of the view that we're trying really hard to do, I hope you can tell, the right thing at United and focus on just doing the right thing. That applies to a lot of areas. It applies to our vaccine vaccine requirements. It also applies, of course, to climate change. But also, I think I've realized, we have a unique platform. We're in the press and we're in the public eye. Even though we're a smaller company than a lot of the other people on this call, we're probably in the public eye more than most. And that gives us a platform to make a bigger difference. And so we and I are working hard, first within aviation, to get people in aviation to view the problem differently. There's a lot of people in our industry today who think, well, if Exxon and Chevron will just produce a sustainable aviation fuel, as long as it costs less than jet fuel, then I'll buy it. And otherwise, leave me alone. And I'm pitching to them that can't be our answer. It shouldn't be our answer. That we have to be a part of partnering with people like Conrad and other companies to help commit to buying the fuel, commit investment dollars.
So Scott, sorry to interrupt, but give us an example of some of the collaboration, some of the partnerships that you're doing now within your own sector then?
So we don't have many yet. We have some that are on the drawing board, particularly with airlines around the world. Around the world, we've got a lot of partners, companies like airlines like Lufthansa, SAS, Air New Zealand. Some that we aren't traditionally partners with, Qantas, ANA, others that we're talking about trying to do the right thing. I think the United States is a little behind Europe and probably Australia and New Zealand, to be blunt, with taking this seriously. But there are more of us now talking about, we had an IATA meeting a week ago in Boston, and I feel a growing consensus around, or a larger group of airlines around the world that want to really solve this problem. And once we get the ball rolling, I think everyone gets on board.
Okay.
So our goal is to get the ball rolling so that everyone has to get on board.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Rasmus, do you see the same kind of traction in shipping?
Yes. I mean, in terms of just going one step back, in terms of investments and how to do it and get around this, we see things happening. We see companies, including our own, looking at investment differently. We would never invest into the fuel itself before, but now we are quite far down the road in terms of investing into zero carbon fuels. So that's a strategy change for Trafigura. In terms of how to bring technology forward, collaboration also happens there. We have co-invested or co-sponsored the technology development of the manned green ammonia engine. So in shipping, just for those who aren't aware, we see two fuels as the transport fuels of the future. It's the green methanol and it's the green ammonia. It's coming from green fuels, zero or very limited carbon content. The challenge that we have as an industry is the price gap versus the fossil fuels, and collaboration cannot fix that. Yeah. So just to give you an example, I mean, traditional shipping fuel today costs around $600 per metric ton. Green ammonia, as an example, would cost $600 to $700, but the calorific content, i.e. what you get out of what you put in, is 2.3 times less. So you have an equivalent cost of about $1,400 per ton. It's such a significant price gap, which is impossible for any private enterprise to bridge through a partnership with someone. And this is why policymakers need to understand that they need to come and regulate so we can get a global price on carbon. And without that, it's not realistic to expect a rapid transition. So that's the challenge we have as an industry.
And I'm going to come back to you in just a second. I just want to get it. Everyone's been talking about policy and policy frameworks and policy support. So Aditya, let me just get a sense from you on this. You know, we talk often of carrots and sticks, you know, on the policy side. How wrong do you feel is that balance right now? The way policymakers are trying to guide business through this.
So, Axel, maybe I'm being provocative, but apart from Europe, I don't see any carrots or sticks anywhere from regulators. But let us talk about globally what needs to be done. I think Rasmus talked about a global carbon price. That's a stick approach, right? Fundamentally, because we're basically doing a new tax. The carrot approach, which is what the EU is trying to achieve, is a CBAM, right? This is a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which I think is very unique and very, very interesting, because when it was launched, it is more of an industry response, our response, that can we have a level playing field? Because if we're going to decarbonize, our costs are rising, other costs are not rising, we're going to get dumped. And now what we see is that as the CBAM is becoming a reality, we see a lot of other countries which have active trading engagement with Europe are reviewing their own carbon policy engagement. So that's a great example of a carrot working. And I can see there's a lot of controversy around it, but I do think the CBAM is going to get implemented. And then I think others will either implement some sort of carbon regime or something similar so they can continue to trade. Yeah. So we almost have the start of a new World Trade Organization in carbon, which I think is something quite interesting.
It's possible to build on this, because I think all of our panelists, Anne has talked about this, Scott, Conrad, Aditya, the policy piece and government action. And I think it's important that this lands properly. I don't think any of the companies are saying we're not going to do anything until we get government action. I think it's this piece of public-private partnership. So we've talked a lot about the collaboration between companies within sectors and across sectors, but this is also the collaboration between the public and private sectors. And I think what I would love to hear from some of the panelists is how they feel that some of the pilot projects, some of the investments you are working on are a precursor for allowing governments to act. And in a sense, how you can use those to co-design the right enabling policy environments with governments. I think it was Anne who talked a bit earlier about the role that tax credits and feed-in tariffs and others have played, the critical role they've played in the last several decades in scaling wind and solar and getting those technologies to cost parity. So how do we see that playing out, and that public-private piece in accelerating the scale of technologies that you're investing in now?
All right, thanks, Anthony. Anne, why don't you come in on that?
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thank you, Anthony. In the US, Aditya is right. The EU has at least created of a framework that we can do. In the US, it's nascent at best, but of course, there have been a series of executive actions. And I do think that we will see more consistency in cap and trade, as well as carbon pricing, whether it's a tax or the markets make it work. Here's a very basic thing that has to happen. And I'll use financial services only because we have a little different mandate than the rest of you. There was collaboration amongst the 6 largest banks in the US that joined EU and UK banks, but the US to commit to net zero by 2050. The only way we get to net zero is that every client gets to net zero. There is no net zero for us unless the entire ecosystem, including every client. Now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of clients amongst us. And in the first steps to get to carbon neutrality, they just can't get all the way there because it doesn't exist. The renewable grids aren't linked. There's not enough renewable opportunities. Just talking about sustainable aviation fuel, that needs to be 100% at some point by 2050. So I still say, and I'll beat this drum, that we need to create some kind of incentive pool so that when you're going your last mile and you can't quite get there, aggregating funds and making it part of concessionary capital or first loss money, working with whether it's multi-development, multilateral banks or World Bank in general, or just as part of blended finance, we could stand up and create scale much more quickly this way. Yeah. And we need governments to embrace the market dynamics, not resist them.
And on the multilateral development banks in particular, I heard Mark Carney a couple of days ago said these banks need to scale up their ambition in terms of financing provided to these sorts of projects, investments that could be scaled up to, I think he said 100 billion a year. I mean, it's quite a big ask, that, is it not?
Well, actually, it's doable. The trouble is right now their covenants and charters don't allow for it. So these were, World Bank was an outcome of Bretton Woods. We're talking about decades ago. And even the financial instruments weren't the same. So they need to be updated so that we can scale and we can put in blended finance so they can do more, because we could get concessionary capital in here and you could get it from these, instead, to Scott's point, instead of trying to do forestation or reforestation, which even if it were effective on a very small scale, doesn't even get close to what needs to be done. So we are in discussion with those organizations on behalf of sort of the financial services industry. And I think a couple of betas on that would really be helpful to prove the case.
Okay, good. And thank you. Look, I've got a wary eye on the time, and we've got some good questions coming in from the audience. But here's a general one for you. And maybe, Scott, you want to kick this one off. Our shift away from fossil fuels is experiencing a pretty significant pressure point right now. Gas prices up, demand for coal up, petrol shortages here in the UK. I mean, I can't tell you the lines I've been in trying to get gas for my car. Are these just bumps in the road, do you think, or is this proof that switching costs, financial and psychological, are way, way higher than we thought they'd be?
Well, I think it's proof that it's not as simple as some people say it's going to be. And I think the point is we've got to get to realism on the other side. I talked about realism on one side with carbon offsets. But for example, a lot of people on here have talked about the need for 24/7 energy. Like, our societies are not going to accept that the electricity goes off when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. And it's really hard to envision a world where there's enough battery storage. And even if you use hydrogen for the battery storage, it takes so much energy, that's a long way off in the future. And it gets to points like we probably need nuclear energy. If we want to really go renewable, the backup can't be coal or natural gas. You see it happening around the world. It's happened in some places in Texas, in California. It's happened in the UK recently, where when renewables aren't there, you wind up going to coal and natural gas, and it creates huge problems. And this is one of the points. We've got to get an answer to keep the grid 24/7 if we're going to switch to more renewables. And that probably means nuclear. And it's a conversation we're just going to have to get comfortable with, I think, or society's not going to accept electricity going off when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine.
Yeah, and Rasmus, to you as you know, with your head of decarbonisation hat on, what do you make of these pressure points right now? Could this throw the whole decarbonisation off kilter?
No, I don't think so. Listen, I mean, decarbonization is something we all have to do. Society has really run ahead of what technology has been able to deliver. The big challenge we have, will there be enough of the green fuels? And the answer is there will not be enough green fuels unless you have a regulatory regime which allows for investments into these fuels. Because now the technologies are there on the engine side and they are ready by 24, 25. That's what can keep it back, the availability of the fuels. But I don't think this road bump, and it's not an insignificant one, of course, that's clear, because it's something which is on everybody's mind as we speak. But we're also coming out of special circumstances, whether that's the Brexit, whether that's COVID, whether it's special supply chain issues. I think it's a road bump, but I think policymakers will be able to look beyond that. And that's my hope as well.
Okay, very good. Look, I'm going to come back to all of you with a couple of general questions at the end, but I want to get to some of our audience questions, and these are jumping around a little bit, but I do want to get some of these in. Conrad, this one's to you. You mentioned the need to electrify and purchase renewable energy to address the 60% of emissions that come from energy in the chemical industry. What's needed to address the other 40%?
Yeah, what's needed to address the other 40%, I think I mentioned it, is really changing processes and making them more efficient. Let me clarify one point. I talked about scope 1, scope 2 for the chemical industry here, the total of 2.9 gigatons. What is even much more impactful is actually the so-called handprint that the chemical industry has. So chemicals today are in more than 95% of the products that you touch day in, day out. And here actually, what we need is new processes, new products, new technologies. To the point that Erasmus just made on ammonia, green ammonia as a fuel. Yes, there is a significant cost premium today. So green ammonia has to be made from green hydrogen, and green hydrogen is then manufactured through the electrolysis of water, which can be either with solar, wind, or renewable energy. That is a massive change, and it is true that there are no large-scale green hydrogen plants today. What is very important in my view, Axel, and I want to come back briefly on the discussion about carrots and sticks and what works. Let's be realistic here. These are new technologies, and if you talk about a new technology, typically this goes through a learning curve. If you talk about new technologies, they need to be scaled. And before all of that is sort of completed, these products come at a substantial cost premium. So, and now maybe back to the earlier point in the discussion, what is needed then? Well, either you price in the cost of carbon in the existing products and processes, which is, let's say, indeed the stick, or you actually provide this incentive for R&D, incentive for CapEx, to basically support the industry to indeed build a green hydrogen plant, to indeed build a green ammonia plant. And that's specifically for the chemical industry. What's clear is if you actually don't use the stick and you don't use the carrot, not a lot will happen, because we're actually talking about products that indeed, as Erasmus says, are substantially more expensive than the competing fossil-based products.
Okay, good, Conrad, thank you. A question for Scott and then for Aditya, and you know, I'll wrap it up into this question from me. What in terms of innovation, in terms of technology, you know, what excites you the most? What could possibly be the most bankable for the banks? Let's start with sustainable aviation fuels and where that fits in, Scott. And a question comes through asking, what are we talking about when we talk about sustainable aviation fuels? Are they carbon neutral, or is it just replacing non-renewable sources with renewable ones?
They are renewable. You know, this is essentially taking, you know, as Conrad talked about, the leftover farm product, and instead of having that, you know, decompose and turn into methane and other carbon in the atmosphere, use it to create fuel and create a cycle that, you know, it is net zero. So they are real. It is the most obviously identifiable opportunity for aviation. And I think Anne's point was a really good one. The reason this government support is so important is it gives people like banks the ability to finance projects. And that's what happened in wind and solar. Because you can look out over 20 years and say, if I make a loan, I'm going to get my money back. Today, it's all venture capital looking for 30% returns because there's a big risk. And it's hard to get enough capital attracted to the industry if you have that. If you have that certainty from a government framework, you can start to get a much deeper pool of capital because you have certainty of what's going to happen for the next few years. That's why the government support is so important.
Okay, good. Scott, thank you. Aditya, a question for you on green steel. Of course, you touched on this earlier. Is the steel that you're talking about truly green as in no carbon steel, or is it carbon accounting and offsets that you're really talking about here?
Sure. Thank you, Axel. It's not carbon offsets. What it is it's a bit like what Conrad spoke about. We spent about 200 million euros in a bioethanol facility. So we capture the CO2 from our blast furnaces and convert it into bioethanol. So basically we have done a CCU, and so our carbon footprint decreases, and that delta of steel that we make is called our certified green steel. So it's audited by a third party. It's not carbon offset, it's actual reduction in CO2 in our existing process. We also have another product, which is called recycled and renewable steel. And by 2025 or 2026, we will have the first full-scale industrial net zero steel facility. So that's our journey, and that's why we're starting to germinate the marketplace today.
Okay, good. Thank you, Aditya. I want to just throw it over to Anthony quickly and reference the MPP Transition Finance initiative. And this, of course, the question here is turning GFAN's commitments, as Anne talked about, into flows of finance for green projects, for steel plants, for zero emission vessels, etc., etc. Anthony, do you want to say a couple of words?
Yes, thank you, Axel. And we've shared a link to the report in the chat. I mean, in a sense, with Mission Possible, we work very much on these transition strategies based off the roadmaps. We know where we need to be in 2025, 2030, 2035, etc. We're now working very closely with the US government on a to-be-announced initiative on creating forward demand curves for all of these products. But how do we make that bankable? How do we turn all of the commitments we're seeing from financial institutions to put money into climate finance, for asset managers and asset owners to align their portfolios with Paris and net zero? How do we actually turn all of that and those pathways into flows of finance into the green steel plants we need, into the rollout of hydrogen infrastructure across the world to power those zero emissions vessels and those sort of low carbon planes, the SAF plants that we have to have? And maybe, SAF is probably, and trying to get SAF plants built for this sort of 10% by 2030 is one of the most urgent financing needs. So maybe Scott, but I'm sure Anne will have a view on this as well.
Go ahead, Anne. And look, let me throw in there as well. You talked about bankability here. What excites you most in what you're seeing in terms of technology, in terms of innovation right now?
Is that to me or to Anne?
No, that's to Anne. That's to Anne.
Okay, thank you. Well, so much of it, I mean, what we're seeing in the sustainable aviation fuels, if we could scale that up, it is possible to scale that up more quickly if you had the proper tax incentives in place and harmonized throughout the Western world. And that alone, I think, would help. I mean, Scott, you can speak to that, but just speaking to, rather than making one company try to bring an entire industry forward on its own balance sheet, there is a way to accelerate. And again, we've seen it in the past with other industries in wind, solar, and electric cars. So I'll just use one thing. 4 years ago, we thought that we would do about $300 billion of climate financing in the next 10 years. Last year, we announced we thought we would do $1 trillion. And the difference is the scalability of electric cars and the opportunities that we see should we have any kind of cooperation from governments on new technologies that sort of follow wind, solar, hydrogen, etc.
Okay, good. And thank you very, very much indeed. Look, again, with an eye on the time, we've got so many questions from our audience, really could go on, but I want to throw a general question at each of you to finish up. You know, and that is how possible you think this mission that we're talking about really is. You know, what you expect from your sector. And look, let me wrap a question that I've just seen from an audience member come in into this. Apart from being beneficiary of green energy once developed, do any of you suggest each industry should commit certain percentage of revenue for this transition? Why don't you throw that in there as well? Scott, let me kick it off with you. This mission, how possible, how hopeful are you?
So it is possible, but it's urgent. And the problem with climate change is the feedback loops are almost all positive. That as climate change gets worse, it creates positive feedback loops, whether it's tundra melting or reduction of polar ice cap, they're almost all positive. And so we have to get serious about solving it. But I do think it's solvable if we get serious. You know, I think we're hitting on the most important point. Private industry won't do it on its own without the right carrots and sticks from government. But with that architecture, with a price on carbon, with the right credits for things like sustainable aviation fuel, it is solvable, but it is urgent, and we can't keep kicking the can down the road and talking about it. We need some real action.
Yeah, okay. And Aditya, how about you? And, you know, I hope people don't watch this and think this is another example of us kicking the can down the road and rhetoric. You know, I hope we want people to leave here feeling inspired. What do you think, Aditya?
Yeah, no, you're right, Axel. I think, though, a little bit of this is rhetoric because the decisions are going to be taken by policymakers, right? And so I'm very hopeful. I echo everything that Scott has said. If I sat here in the steel business 2 years ago and where I'm sitting today, I see many more solutions and less problems. So I think clearly the journey has been extremely encouraging and we see solutions. I couldn't have said that 2 years ago where I would have said that, oh yeah, we see a pathway to green steel. But I think we need a policy framework. And so I hope COP26 is very successful. I think there are huge questions that need to be answered in COP26. Is there a global carbon price? Is there going to be CBAM? And even more importantly, what's going to happen to the developing world, right? Today, if you look at the steel industry, half of the steel is produced in China. So we can do everything that we want, but if there is no global unified policy arrangement, then it's very, very difficult to make progress. But I'm hopeful because in the last 2 years, the amount of progress we have seen, the momentum, everything that we said, the feedback loop, all of that is pointing in the right direction, but we really need the policymakers to step up their game. Okay, good. And Conrad, I know you think the same. We need a policy framework from COP to help move things forward. Are you hopeful that we're going to get that?
I'm not a politician, I'm a businessman, but let me maybe repeat the urgency here. So I think it's important to first of all realize the technologies are there. Most of the technologies are there, by and large. What's needed really is to scale up and to commercialize. And yes, we're not at scale yet, and we're not at the end of the learning curves. So in order to basically accelerate this, I think there's a role on the one side to price in carbon for existing processes, existing products. On the other hand, incentives in terms of R&D, in terms of CapEx. Without that, I think it's going to be difficult. And a final comment, this policy framework really ought to be a global framework. It can't be that we just only have carbon taxation in Europe and someone building a plant outside Europe, importing into Europe, basically could circumvent this. So this has to be really a global level playing field. And I'm very hopeful, but at the same time, I realize this is not an easy task ahead of us. But it has to be.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Conrad. And Erasmus, you clearly, this is close to your heart. You Trafigura have made that carbon levy proposal. How I mean, you talked about a little bit of traction now, but when it comes to global frameworks, level playing fields, are we going to be sitting here a year from now having the same conversation we're having today?
No, we will be much more educated. Policymakers will have pushed it forward. The question is, will they have pushed it far enough? And this is the critical part. We have COP26. 2 weeks later, we have the next IMO MEPC meeting where global shipping regulation is decided upon. Just one quick step back. I know time is running out. We have actually proposed that the charters, the users of the ships, pays when they charter higher polluting ships. So that will drive behavioral change from the users of the ships. It's a key part of our proposal to IMO. I will not go into that, time is running out, but I would like to think we are definitely much further than where we are. We've seen the progress the last 12 months. We need to continue to push and push to bring it forward. And we can. We are on a mission possible. And that is where we need to push for.
Okay, very good. And let me finish it up with you. You know, again, is whether the mission is possible. I'm not sure if you're going to Glasgow in a few weeks' time, but clearly there's going to be a lot of talking going on there. You know, all the big financial services players are there, the asset managers. You know, some say they're paying lip service, too much lip service. Some saying that there's something behind this. Mark Carney's going to be there with GFANZ. Yeah, do you think we're going to leave Glasgow feeling we're in a better place?
Yeah, I think we will feel in a better place, although we won't have solved the problem. I do think you have a number of partnerships, whether it's a Sustainable Markets Initiative that's chaired by His Royal Highness Prince Charles and co-chaired by our CEO, Brian Moynihan, GFANZ, the Mission Possible Partnership. I think we're all focused on the same thing, which is we need this greater transparency. We need a price on carbon. We need government incentives. We need a market solution for carbon credits because this offset market is just too small relative to this very big need. And I think there is cohesion around those thoughts. And the next step will be shining a very bright light on it at COP26. And I think it's from there that the action will be taken. I don't think it will be solved at COP26.
Okay. All right. Look, I've got to stop it there. I'm sorry I've got to stop it there. I really do want to go on. Yeah, maybe all of us should regroup in a year and really see how far we've come. Scott Kirby, United Airlines, Aditya Mittal from ArcelorMittal, Anne Finucane from Bank of America, Conrad Kaiser from Clarion, Rasmus from Trafigura, and Anthony Hobley and Faustine from MPP. Thanks very much indeed to all of you for talking with us so candidly today. There's a lot on the table here. Clearly COP's coming up. Clearly it's an exciting time. You know, there are some who say we've set ourselves up a little bit too high to fail. There are others who say, no, look, we really need to reach for the stars here. There's going to be a white paper on the back of this discussion if you've opted in for that. I want to thank the Mission Possible Partnership for bringing us all together and for Reuters for hosting this event today. Remember, you can follow the conversation on missionpossiblepartnership.org or see it on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks again to the panelists. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.